I originally did a collaboration piece for one of the websites I write for where we talked about hidden gems and favorite games that most people may not have played. And one of the submissions by one of the other writers was for the game Invisigun. That sounded like a very fascinating multiplayer based game that also shot itself in its foot in terms of how it approached building and maintaining it. So for today's critical thought, I want to talk about the pros and cons of multiplayer-based games and what every single multiplayer game needs to have not only on day 1, but maybe day negative 100, if they want to have a chance of surviving in the market today. As I've said on previous critical thoughts, multiplayer games, especially those built on live service, have become the quintessential moneymaker for a lot of studios. Be it Path of Exile, Warframe, mobile games, Fortnite, Overwatch, you name it. And we've always had that period, or we've had these swings between multiplayer focus and single player focus. And for a lot of indie developers who have the chance of creating something original, it has afforded them the opportunity that makes them very great and major pushes forward in terms of multiplayer. Be it kind of the asymmetric cooperative game of something like, what was it, Everyone Stops Reading or The Bomb Will Explode. We have a slew of beat-em-ups, party-based games, Ultimate Chicken Horse we really enjoyed, even stuff that has gone and really blown up like Fall Guys and Among Us. And it has created this opportunity for a lot of developers in terms of why don't we create our own? And the problem that multiplayer has in lieu of single player is that there's a lot more that goes on behind the scenes, or what is required, rather than what we see with a single player game. In a single player title, you just need to have, well, a good game. That's it. That's the entire video right there. I think we just solved all of game marketing right there, right? But for developers who are either working on a multiplayer based mode or multiplayer as the focus of their game, there's a lot more that goes on with kind of the behind the scenes or the architecture side. And don't worry, we'll talk about community in the next part of this video, than we see in single player. A few years ago, I made a video and a piece about the Steam Remote Local, or the ability to play a single or a local-based multiplayer game online on Steam, and why that was a very huge deal for a lot of indie developers. And the reason why is that when it comes to multiplayer, one of the biggest things you need is an architecture. You need some kind of framework for how multiplayer works. Because here's one of the sad things about today's market. Local only is very much the arrow in the knee or the shot in the back that's going to ruin your multiplayer-based game. You see, in today's world, we don't have the luxury, especially with the pandemic going on, to everyone get together and play 4, 6, 12-player multiplayer in our respective homes. I did that as a LAN party for Halo a long time ago. And while Steam's remote play is a viable option, it also does not give you basically everything under, all wrapped up with a nice bow. You still need to make sure that your game, from a foundational standpoint, is set up for multiplayer. That means, of course, being able to support multiple peripherals. Some games will only let you play with one gamepad and everyone else on keyboard. Or the first person who types something in locks the controls for everyone else. These are some of the UI UX things that we don't normally discuss, and I think a lot of people don't even really consider, but it's very important to have in mind today. Being able to quickly and effortlessly determine, okay, I'm on gamepad 1, you're on gamepad 2, you're on keyboard, you're on mouse. Make it as easy and as seamless as possible to do is also important. Because we've played multiplayer games where it becomes a frustrating ordeal to try and get everything organized. Okay, I'm on the controller, but I need to set up your key presses before you can play anything. But wait, your key sets up are like kind of, let's say, up is W, down is M, delete is attack, and then numpad 4 is dodge. And again, this is why UI UX really matters here. Because you need to think about, what does it feel like to comfortably play my game with 2, 3, 4, 5, however many people you have in the room with you, or if it's doing it remotely. Now, speaking about online play, again, we cannot stress this enough for new players watching. It's something I've spoken to a lot of developers about. If you are trying to build a successful multiplayer game today, you must have some kind of online architecture, either a client-host system connecting to servers. The days in which you can just release a game and say, okay, in order to sell multiplayer, you need to find someone on a third-party server, you need to look up your IP address, send it to them, download a third-party program in order to connect, have them give them their IP address to you, and then in 40 minutes to an hour and a half, we can play a 10-minute multiplayer game. And that may sound like hyperbole to some of you, but there are a lot of games, especially in the late 90s into the early to mid 2000s, that are a nightmare in order to sell for multiplayer. Be it because the servers were turned down, or they didn't have servers to begin with and they just try to use a direct IP connection. And this is why, if you are trying to build a long-term multiplayer game, and again, this is something that I said in my previous video and in my book, if you are trying to build a multiplayer game today, you are building a live service game, whether you want to or not. Because no one wants to play a game that only has 2 weeks of content and then that's it. So you need to have this architecture set up day one, because you do not want people to feel frustrated or annoyed or even confused as to how to play your game. As a really good example of shooting yourself in the foot with probably like a rocket launcher, the game GTFO, which was kind of a spiritual successor, was made by the developer behind, I believe, Payday or Payday 2, I forget which one. And this was going to be the next step in 4-player cooperative shooter, Left 4 Dead-ish, but in even more beyond way. It all sounds great, but when it came out in early access day one, there was literally no way to connect or find people in the game to play with. There was no online architecture. The only way to find someone and play it was you had to go to their Discord. You had to, say, looking for games, I'm trying to find something, give someone your Steam invite, your Steam idea, friend them, and then they would have to manually send you a friend invite in-game. And again, I cannot stress this point enough. You do not want people to jump through hoops to play and enjoy your game. Because if you do that, a lot of people are just going to say, nope, and they're going to leave, and then they will never come back. Another example was the game Full Metal Furies. This was the game from the developer of Rogue Legacy. We played this one all the way through on stream a few years ago, and we loved that game. But again, when it was released day one, no way to connect online to people or find games. And this was a game built around multiplayer base or multiplayer design. You could play it single player, but it's kind of like, yes, the single player is there, but it's not the real focus. Like playing a game like Left 4 Dead or Payday with just bots. And this is again why, if you're trying to build a game around any kind of multiplayer experience, you need to have this architecture set up day one. Because this can easily kill a game's chance. And once you lose your audience's interest, as we've seen with games like GTFO struggling, with Full Metal Furies, and even some of the older titles that my mind's blank on, I just remember one, Evolve, that once the community leaves or they just feel annoyed with your game, that starts the doomsday counter or the doomsday clock for when your game is going to die. And it is very rare for a game to pull out of that dovetail down once they start losing and hemorrhaging their community and their fans. So, for this first part, we focused on the architecture, making sure it's easy to play your game, making it easy to set up for multiple people to enjoy your title. But there's still one other factor we didn't discuss. And this is the one that it doesn't matter if your game is the easiest, most stream-friendly, most multiplayer-friendly game on the market or even in the entire world. Because if you don't have this next point, your game is going to die. And with that lovely stinker, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk more about that. But as always, if you're interested in my thoughts on design, then check out my game design books. For entry-level students, we have 20 Essential Games to Study, and then the Game Design Deep Dive series that takes an extensive look at different genres, with free-to-play coming in 2022. When it comes to building a healthy multiplayer-based game, we've seen essentially two styles of multiplayer. We have the local, play with your friends, that kind of thing, and that's what we spoke about in the last part, in terms of setting up the architecture, making sure it's easy and seamless to get into these games. But then there are games that are built around larger multiplayer, whether it's from a competitive standpoint or a game that is built solely on multiplayer. And for that, there's one thing that every one of these games needs, and if it doesn't have it, they are doomed. And that is a healthy and stable community and player base for these games. And one of the easiest ways to kill your game, unfortunately, is to wait until day 1 or even day 0 to start thinking about this. When we talk about single player games, again, single player games, you buy it off Steam, you play whenever you want, you can do whatever you want with that title, refund it if you don't like it, keep it, put it in the backlog, whatever. But multiplayer games exist very much in the now. That if I go to play your game, whether it is at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 6 o'clock in the morning, after school, before work, whatever, and if I can't get into a multiplayer game at that point, I'm not going to bother coming back to that game again. And this is why, if you're trying to build any kind of multiplayer-based game today, you need to be really considering the community. Not day 1, not day 10, but maybe day negative 100. Maybe even at the start of your game's development. How are you going to reach people? How are you going to get people interested in your game? This is where things such as having a public beta weekend or a free play weekend can help. But it's something for every developer watching this you need to consider if you're building a multiplayer game. If on day 1 of your game I go to play it and it takes more than a minute to start a match, or even I can't even get a match on day 1, that is a very sure sign that this game is going to die. And for a lot of developers watching this right now, you may be laugh crying as you're hearing this. But the question now turns to, how do you get a community for your game? This is where having good social media practices, reaching out to people, and even marketing and advertising your game really have to come into play. Because again, it doesn't matter how creative your game is, if people don't want to play it, and if the people who do want to play it can't get a match going, then it's just basically, again, that dovetail effect or the downward spiral. And this is why multiplayer-based games are oftentimes very high risk, high reward. That you can have a game like Fall Guys or Among Us, after it bounced back, become huge in the industry. And once you hit that peak level, it becomes almost near impossible for that game to fail, with multiple collaborations, multiple marketing events, etc., etc. But the problem, and what a lot of indie developers face, is how do you get to that point? And this is, again, why you need to consider what your community is. And again, a healthy community for a multiplayer game is not just made up of nothing but new players or nothing but hardcores. It has to be a healthy mix of everything and in between. You want to be able to sign into a game and have fun. Whether that fun is just trying to learn for the first time, or just trying to get into a competitive match and raise your ranking, your LO score, and so on. And if the game is not set up to meet those varieties of demands, you're going to end up with a very lopsided community. If there's nothing but experts in your space, it becomes very daunting and frustrating for somebody new to come in and try and play your game. If your game is made up of nothing but novices and new players, then there's nothing that really takes that next step forward. Once you've played the game, you want to try and master it, and then you realize there's no one here. You're all alone in mid-rank or top rank, then the game becomes boring. And not to mention, this is, again, where we see that circular effect of streamers and YouTubers. You want people to cover this game. You want people to talk about how great the multiplayer is, or show off their weird fails or wacky games, because that gets people interested. It shows them that this game has legs. And again, it's why when it comes to multiplayer like this, once a game succeeds, it keeps on succeeding. Once it fails, it is not going to come back, with under very rare exception. Because again, in the time that you're taking to fix your multiplayer game, there's probably another dozen or so being released on Steam, Epic, and so on, all taking attention away from it. And people do not like to go to a dead game. They don't want to return to a game that failed and think, oh, maybe this time the game will succeed. They want to go to a game that's doing well and go, hey, this game is great, and look, we have all this stuff coming down the line. And this is, again, why you need to be really concerned. When, in another piece I'm writing, I'm talking about Ironclad Tactics, one of my favorite games from Zachtronics. It was a game that was released with both single-player and multiplayer modes. And the problem is that the multiplayer, while from a functional standpoint was there day one, from a community standpoint it was not. And a mode that doesn't have people to play with is a dead mode. This is why for a lot of games, and what we've seen as a kind of a shift in the industry, is that for most of the 2000s and early 2010s, that every single player game had to have a multiplayer mode, no matter what. These days, developers, I think, have learned the lesson that it's better to either do really amazing single player or really amazing multiplayer, but not try to do both of them and, mess up on one or have one be the imbalance factor. And as you're trying to build your game, it's something you really need to consider. How are people going to discover your title? What does it feel like to play your game day 1, day 50, day 100? And you also need to, again, be aware of how your community or the pools of your player differ. Casual players don't want to deal with hardcores and vice versa. Looking at the piece that was written about Invisigun, they had that issue where they opened it up strictly to the experts and hardcores, and then on day 1, all the new players just got completely trashed. And this is why you need to be really careful. It's why it's okay to have free weekends, free trials. Get the word out. And I would say if you are, hesitant or wary about marketing and reaching out about that, multiplayer games is where you need to do some heavy marketing. You need people to know about your game, again, weeks in advance. Because once the game is out, your new challenge is going to be, how do I keep things going? How do I grow? How do I not lose, 90% of my player base week 1? Because we've seen some games that have failed in just that. But guess what? That is another topic for another day. So, my question for those of you watching this, can you think of a multiplayer game that did things very differently? So we're not talking about your standard FPS, your standard Battle Royale, RTS, and so on, that managed to become a fan favorite. And can you think of a game that did fail on its launch in terms of multiplayer, and in some way, shape, or form managed to bounce back, even if it was just for a short while? Let me know in the comments down below. Do the liking and subscribing as well. Check out our Discord and Patreon, and come back for daily discussions on game design here and on game wisdom, where is in the art and science of games.